So we're going to start the Affordable Housing Education Series today. We have Jennifer Hall and June Thomas here joining us to do the presentation, and I'm going to hand it over to Teresa, who will probably do a much better intro of tonight's education series, part 1.
Thanks, Foster. I'm so excited to start this off tonight. The Housing and Human Services Advisory Board and also Jennifer Hall helped us come up with the topics for this educational series. And just a shout out to Jess Leetaw, we had this conversation with her and a few other folks, including Amanda Carlisle, folks from Avalon Housing, about wanting to do the educational series a feof years ago. We stole a few of those topics, refined them a little bit. And really, this whole series is helping to inform the HHSAB, because one of the things that we want to do is, of course, learn, but use this learning to help inform some recommendations for policy around the affordable housing millage and how it will be utilized for non-city led projects. So we expect there to be enough funds, hopefully, if all goes well, that there could be an opportunity to put out like a request for proposals and other things. So we need to really understand a lot about affordable housing development, what to be prioritized, how to think about supportive services, a lot of those pieces. So that's a lot of what we'll be talking about over the next 7 months. But we want to start off with, a deep understanding of history of affordable housing and public housing. And we've talked before about a lot of the racial impacts of national housing policies and whether it's in the, in government, we had racist practices in our industries and sort of what that's done and how that impacts our landscape today, because those land use patterns, obviously, once they establish, they're very hard to change. So we want to make sure we understand that history and learn from it. And so we're going to be building on that a little bit each time as we go on. And I'm so excited to kick it off with Professor Jude Manning-Thomas, who's going to start us off tonight with some of that history. And I believe I may need to give you the ability to share your screen, I'm thinking. So let me do that. And then we can get started. Just a moment.
Well, while she's doing that, I'm really honored and pleased to be here. I'm surprised you picked me. I'm not sure I would count myself. After I said yes, I thought of several people that would do a great job with this, but I guess you're stuck with me now, so I can get the ball started. And
actually, I'm going to interrupt you just for a second, because Council Member Medina reminded me we have 2 council members here, and I just want to acknowledge that they're joining us tonight. I'm so sorry. So thank you so much to Council Members Hayner and Griswold who are with us tonight. Did I miss anybody else? Did I catch them, Council Member Medina? Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for coming tonight, and everybody else. And sorry, Professor, back to you.
That's okay. Now I'm even more nervous. This is really, but anyway, I did just pull a few things. There's so many issues that could be discussed about this issue of the history of affordable housing and segregation that I had to pick and choose. So I just picked a couple of things that are just some points that kind of touch on a brief history, and then I wanted to just show some graphics, some photographs to kind of give you a sense of how things have changed over time. So usually I'm successful with PowerPoint on Zoom, so let's just hope that's the case tonight. So okay, so if we go to slideshow in the beginning. Okay, so again, it's a huge topic, but I thought maybe we'd start by just looking at some main points. And the first one is actually the New Deal. Since I know you have several more months of speakers, and I'm the first one, I think it's important to go back to the origins of this whole idea of affordable housing in the US. And so a good place to start is the New Deal. Although there was federally supported housing before then, with particularly with areas where munitions were being built, it's really the New Deal that kicked things off for both middle-class housing as well as for what we now call affordable housing, but used to be public housing. And then just a couple of comments on racial segregation and just some overall perspectives in terms of what that means. So I think it all starts with the New Deal, because of course the Great Depression sort of blew to smithereens any idea that there was a prosperity that was a given for American society. And people were grasping, looking for how can we deal with all of this unemployment? How can we deal with the hunger and with the lack of shelter that people are facing? And so there were a couple of directions that the nation went after that are particularly relevant for the discussion of housing. The first direction is what I would call support for affordable housing for whites, working middle class, and wealthy people. So there were actually programs that were begun out of that New Deal that predated what we think of now as public housing. And so we had, for example, insurance for mortgages, the housing, what we know as the HOLC, or the Home Ownership Loan Corporation. I think, I know you've probably talked about this, that there was redlining that took place, but perhaps the bigger picture is that this was really one of the first insurance programs to help ordinary people get mortgages. The fact that it was redlining, that it was racially discriminatory, is one aspect of it, but I think looking at it from the other perspective, this was one of the ways that we began to see middle-class people, middle-class white people, who were able to essentially buy a home. And I say middle-class white people, of course, because the maps themselves, these redlining maps, sort of prohibited certain people from applying for these home insurance loans, or these home loans. And the areas that were always red were areas where there was considered to be any intrusion by Blacks, and sometimes by others, such as Asian, or sometimes Jewish, and sometimes even Eastern European. So we had this this program that began, but it did essentially allow a lot of people to buy housing. And this is the top picture, and the bottom picture as well, is from Levittown, New York, which is one of the first of these large subdivisions that was able to be built because of federal support. And that federal support came especially with the FHA, Federal Housing Administration. It's changed names several times, but that was the original one, the National Act of 1934. And then, of course, the Veterans Administration chimed in 1944. And it's because of them that developers were able to build these massive, the first wave of post-war massive suburbs. But again, the FHA and then the VA adopted those maps. And so these suburbs were built as exclusionary suburban developments. And furthermore, the FHA and particularly the HOLC did not invest money in inner city neighborhoods, particularly where there were people of African descent living. So these redlining practices continued for some time. There were very few minorities who could receive any of this assistance, and they were shut out from these suburban areas. And this was very true probably up until the US Civil Rights Act of 1968. otherwise known as the Fair Housing Act, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but it's actually a portion of the US Civil Rights Act of 1968. Someone did a study of minority beneficiaries up to 1959, and I think they calculated that something like 2% of all the loans that were given or insured were for minority people. So it was a way to get housing. I'm presenting it this way because it's actually an affordable housing program for white families, for white working class families, the future middle class. And some of you who know the history of Levittown and other suburbs like that know that those houses were added on to and kept up and protected in various ways. And so now they're worth a lot of money. So this was one way to increase the wealth in these families that were able to get into housing like this. And that wealth accrual was not open to those who were left out. So we have that, we have the FHA and the VA, but we also have mortgage interest deduction. That's an older program that dates back before the New Deal period. But we do have this little quirk in the US tax code that essentially allows many of us, including myself, to get some sort of tax relief based on what we're paying for interest in our mortgages. And I'm sure that many of you know that a good bit of housing costs, if you're buying, is the mortgage interest. And so I couldn't find any later data than this, but in 2016, someone actually calculated that the tax break for mortgage interest deduction was something on the order of $77 billion in 2016. So there is subsidy for middle class families. And I think it's important to recognize that because, you know, I think the public housing budget, the last I looked for 2020, it was something like 12 billion, you know, but we have this enormous investment in helping middle class people to stay middle class. Once you can have a house or you're able to buy a house, so you have generational wealth, then you get certain perks, and this is certainly one of them. Then another one that I just wrote an article about is zoning. I think I hadn't thought about it so much because zoning is such mother's milk for urban planners. You know, we live and breathe zoning. And so it's a deceptive tool because it has many good uses, one of which is to separate houses from noxious uses and from industrial uses. This map on the left is the first zoning map. This is from 1916 from New York. And the one on the right is just a bird's eye view of Ann Arbor's zoning map, which is just divided into segments. But what happened was basically in 1917, the US Supreme Court outlawed racial zoning. And racial zoning was a tool that Southern cities used to set up certain neighborhoods that were only for whites. They used the zoning ordinance to do that. Then in the 1940s, it was 47, the Supreme Court ruled that racially restrictive covenants, forgive me if I got the date wrong, I forgot to look that, but racially restrictive covenants were no longer legally enforceable. And that was another tool that people had used to keep Black people out. And so essentially what they had to do was turn to something else. And the something else they turned to was residential zoning. So zoning, which had been approved by the US Supreme Court in terms of separating types of houses and in some ways separating types of people, was used. This is a map from Bloomfield Township, which is the white area that's up top is Pontiac. And the yellow that you're looking at is basically single family zoning. And so what happened all over the country is that municipalities began to pass zoning ordinances with huge swatches of their cities or their suburbs where only single family housing was allowable. And that immediately cut the level of affordable housing because, of course, many people lived in apartments or lived in duplexes or in whatever to mobile homes as a way of making ends meet. But once those ordinances got put up, and it really took off in the 40s after that Supreme Court decision that said no more racially restrictive covenants. Then over the next few decades, you see the blanketing, like this map shows. This, of course, surrounds the city of Bloomfield Hills. You see the blanketing of these fields, farmers' fields, with single family subdivisions. So because of all that, you have, that is the infrastructure of the federal support for middle class housing. It's pervasive, it's strong, it's unshakable. I don't think we're going to change the tax code. I don't think we're going to change single family zoning, although planners are beginning to talk about that in some of the national literature. I think we have to recognize that that's really where the money goes and where the investment goes in that segment of the market. So then how about support for affordable housing and see in fine print for low-income people, for working class whites, and for minorities? And so that doesn't have nearly the tenacity and the security of the housing that I just showed you. So we did have people who began to think about what should we do in terms of low-income people, and I'm just really finding it necessary to point out that the two best scholars of that were two women, Edith Elmer Wood, who passed away in 1945, but she was the matriarch of studies of low-income housing. And she was the one that agitated for some national solution to this idea of having people ill-housed. And I could talk about her all night, but I will not. And then Catherine Bauer-Worster as well, I could talk about her as well. And she was instrumental in getting the UAW and AFL-CIO to support some of the early legislation for housing, because most of the first housing was not just for people of color, it was for working class people. It was for whites, it was for Blacks. And Catherine Bauer-Worster was a superb politician who was able to get some of that legislation passed. So these ladies and people like them are known as communitarian reformers. And I have one more that I'd like to mention, and that's Josephine Goldman, who's on the right. She's our own Michigan-bred heroine. She worked with Mayor Frank Murphy to essentially figure out how to get Detroit out of the Depression. And she's now in the Women's Hall of Fame for Michigan or something, but just an extraordinary woman. She was the first housing director for the city of Detroit. And I haven't done this research, I'm not sure, she might have been for the state of Michigan. But she was a middle-class, college-educated engineer, mother of 5 children, who took it as her cause to create public housing for the people of Detroit. And I'm sorry, I can't give this talk without talking about her. She's like one of my little guardian angels. But anyway, Josephine Goldman, who happened to be friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, which is a great best friend to have. She even got Eleanor Roosevelt to come to Detroit and to help launch the first public housing development, which was the Brewster Douglas One of the things that she did, Josephine Goldman, was to fight for the right of Black families to have access to public housing, because in those days, there was a fight over who got this housing. This would have been in the 30s, and a lot of people were ill-housed. Unfortunately, we were not ready for racial integration, and so the only way she could get the housing for Black families was to agree to segregated housing, which she did not want. But in that way, we had the first Black development, which was Brewster Projects, and then the first white, which was Parkside, which was farther north. And she was, I think, actually one of the first planners for the state of Michigan, even though she was considered just a houser and just a housewife. She actually planned huge swatches of Detroit for housing. So this was an enormous battle to get this kind of housing. When these women had great influence, the communitarian housers, particularly Edith Elmer Wood, the housing that was built was low-rise. It was designed for families so that they would have access to the outdoors. You can see those are actually clotheslines that are set up. 2 stories at most, 3 or 4 stories. This is the Brewster homes, beautifully landscaped, clean new housing. At the time it was built, it was really just, there was so much pride in the Black community when this was built. My husband, who was born in this development, maybe 2 years after it opened, essentially talks about how favored he was among his friends, because he was living in these spiffy new public housing units that had real concrete blocks for walls and real linoleum tile for floors, and didn't have cracks in the walls. And that was a big deal, because so many of the people in the area that he lived in, Detroit, did not have that. And I just always find it important to tell people this was an enormous triumph to have this housing built by the government. Decent housing at first was an enormous triumph, and it was one of the best things possibly that our government has done in terms of housing at first. This is a picture from that same Brewster project. This is Hastings Street. This is I brought this picture home from the library and showed it to my husband, and he just about had a heart attack. Turns out this was his playground. So he grew up in a townhouse that surrounded this playground, but this was again the influence of these communitarians, that these developments were low-rise with facilities, laundromats inside, and with play facilities. Well, that soon changed as US Congress began to skimp on money and finances, especially for upkeep. This is another picture of that era. That's the same Brewster projects with children playing. But what happened was, in the late 40s, the housers were trying to get more housing built in Detroit, but you can see it was on the edges of the main portion of Detroit. And so this was alarming to white neighborhoods. And so there was an election. I'm really skipping a lot to just go through this, but Mayor Cobo, who promised to protect white homeowners, came into power and changed the plan. And the plan was to build up instead of out. And that's where you began to see in various cities the towers. So the towers were a way to keep Blacks where Blacks belonged, supposedly, which was the deep central city, and to keep the public housing from spreading to what were then the white outer edges of the city of Detroit. And then I'm sure you know that story of what went wrong with these towers. Too tall, poorly maintained, too many families for one elevator, somewhat of a management disaster, in part because there was no money for upkeep. And we've seen this over and over in cities all over. I took this in 2013, just before this was torn down. This was one of the last of the mid-rise buildings in Brewster Douglas. So we have gone on then to a number of other programs. There's, of course, community development block grants, the Hope 6, which was designed to mostly 10 years of fixing some of the worst public housing, especially the high towers, home block grants, low-income housing tax credits. Someone else will have to talk about these programs. There are a lot of affordable housing programs that exist that we're trying to fix this problem, but I've tipped my hand when I told you there was not enough money given for this compared to what we were doing in terms of supporting middle class, unfortunately, predominantly white housing. And so we have racial segregation. We have, you can just see there's just off here is Delaney, so there's Ann Arbor right there. But one of the things that was making this a perfect storm is places like Michigan, which essentially made it very easy for municipalities to form their own governments. So people started forming their own little suburbs to protect themselves from having to have encroachment by people that they didn't want to have there. And that combined with the single family housing to create what is now probably over 300 municipalities within Southeast Michigan with taxing authority. You can see in 1978, the charter township, suburban townships can charter themselves, incorporate with only 2,000 residents. So we have facilitated the creation of these tiny municipalities. But a lot of it seems to be, again, this idea of walling ourselves off from people we don't want to be near. So that leads us to this, this segregated nation. Some people have pointed out that the index of dissimilarity, which is one way of measuring segregation, has declined. It has in some cities. These are in Colorado, the ones, the dotted line down there. Whereas many of the big cities have continued to have very high segregation rates between Blacks and whites, as well as between Hispanics and whites, and little less so between Asians and whites, but always the biggest is between Blacks and whites. Brookings Institute, if you want to know where's the best material that's kind of accessible, I would say the Brookings Institute webpage. If you go to that and type in racial segregation, you'll see many, many important resources that are up to date. And so this, for example, is from April of 2021. Neighborhood segregation persists for Black, Latino, or Hispanic and Asian Americans. They give it for just data for several cities. And what that shows is this particular one shows, okay, so for example, for Chicago, it shows that Blacks are 16% of the metropolitan area, but they live in neighborhoods where the percentage is 62% on average. And so that's another way of looking at this idea of segregation. Where are people really, you can see Detroit. Detroit always comes up. Maybe I should leave this slide, but we always come up looking bad in Michigan. This is another great article from Brookings Institute, The Great Real Estate Reset, Separate, Unequal. persistent residential segregation is sustaining racial and economic injustice in the US. And this came out a year ago, 13 months ago, December 2020. And this again shows a little bit of improvement. If you look between 2000 and 2014 to 2018, of course, we're still waiting for all the census data to be analyzed for 2020. But you can see that whites are still very likely to be in white neighborhoods with just a few minorities, and that's improving just a bit. And this is true for Blacks as well as for Latino and Hispanics. But notice that Blacks are, by and large, still in Black neighborhoods. And that has implications in terms of poverty. So this is not a situation where people are clustering because they just like to be around Blacks. All the studies that we've seen shows that Black people prefer mixed race neighborhoods, but it's very hard to keep those if people keep moving. So not all low-income people live in low-income communities, but you can see that Blacks are very likely to have their low-income people living in low-income communities. And so that has enormous implications for education, for access to training, access to employment, even access to grocery stores. We have people who are studying phenomena like food deserts to really give us a good sense of what happens when this takes place. So you can see there's also segregation for Hispanic, for Native American, and for white. And so this is something that really is an income problem, but it's something that we need to continue to work on. So then main point, the US has supported housing for middle class and wealthy people that is racially discriminatory. Efforts to create housing for low-income people have had fits and starts, but left major needs, and racial segregation continues. So imperatives for today, I think I'm just so pleased that you guys want to hear about this and you're going to do something about it. You know, I'm thinking I should cancel my other meeting. I have to host something at 6:30, but I don't know, I might come back. I might just click off and then come back so I can hear what you guys are saying with this series. But it's so wonderful that we have a few resources to address this and that we can start to think about some different ways of ordering ourselves. So, was that okay? That was, yeah, that was about, okay, that was 30 minutes. So. So I'll stop sharing and see if you have any comments or questions.
There are a couple questions under the Q&A. I don't know if you have access to that. A couple questions from the attendees.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And I can, it might make sense, the specific questions about, so there's a question about co-ops and funding for cooperative housing. June, do you have, maybe you might have something to say about the national landscape about cooperative housing funding? If not, that's okay.
No, I don't, but that's one of those people I would have asked, you know. So we have a wonderful person in our program, Lan Dane, and so I don't know if you would want to just ask her. She teaches a course on housing, and she would know something about co-op housing. I am not familiar with that one.
That's fantastic. And Jennifer might have something to say at the end of her talk.
Great.
Is that something you pick up, Jennifer?
Sure, happy to.
Okay.
Wonderful.
And then the other question was about redlining, which you talked about in your early slides. So if people in the audience missed the first bit of June's talk, we'll have a recording. This is all being recorded, so that'll get shared, and we can circle back to the mortgage implications of redlining. I think those are the other questions in the chat. If attendees have more questions they want to throw in the Q&A.
Amanda has her hand up.
Oh, hi, Amanda.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for sharing so much great information for us. I'm sorry I'm off video just because I have a little bit of an issue with connection right now, but I guess more of a statement kind of reflecting on your presentation. But I think one of the other things that, you know, I've always heard the connection around racial segregation is the federal transportation network and specifically highway network, and how the federal government often went through Black communities to create the highway networks, especially in larger, you know, major cities.
Yeah, so I would really label that as one of the major problems, but I had to choose what to talk about tonight. But yeah, that Highway Act of 1956, as well as the Urban Renewal Acts, which were in the Housing Acts of 1949 and 1954, those two. So it was 49, 54, and 56, with the first two being Urban Renewal and the Highway Act of 1956, that devastated huge swatches of Black communities, including, if you saw the photo that I had of my husband's playground, and there was a commercial district that was right beyond the playground equipment, that was Hastings. And that was taken out during that period to make way for 375. So yes, and then of course what that did is it facilitated great movement, because in those cities that had their highway network was too good, which was the case in Detroit. It was too thorough. It did a wonderful job of emptying out the central business district and also allowing people who left for suburban areas to get back to work as long as they were still coming into the central city without having to live in the central city. But you have to think about it in terms of which cities. So for example, in Chicago, the highways were not quite so pervasive. And so if any of you have sat on the Dan Ryan Expressway, you know that that's a strong disincentive to move out of Detroit. And out of Chicago, because that Dan Ryan Expressway is so bad. And so they have rail lines and they have the L, and that allowed for some cohesion. And so you didn't have quite the exodus that you saw in Detroit. But yeah, I think my big ones would be certainly the highway legislation, urban renewal, the FHA mortgage insurance programs. Those would be the ones that really, and for certain states like Michigan, the annexation laws that let these small suburbs form. Yes, but yes, if I had 4 hours, I could talk about all those things, but you guys can't take but 30 minutes, I'm sure. Okay, I think that's it for questions, right?
Sounds like
You know, guys, I should say,
it does look like there's a question among our attendees.
yes, please, Travis.
I was actually just going to call attention. We had at least one person ask how to ask a question in the Q&A. And so another question might come in there, but just wanted to draw attention to that section as well.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, it looks like Kathy Griswold has her hand up, or showed up on my screen.
Kathy, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm actually old enough to have studied public housing back in 1973 and worked in the Detroit area. So I really appreciate this history. And I think it's very important that policymakers understand that history. And I don't know if I got this quote right, but about the towers, the way to keep people where they belong.
Yes.
And I found that very powerful, and that is what I saw. And my question is, are you familiar with the Green Baxter public housing that's on the corner of Green and Baxter Roads?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay. It's near the bushes there on Green Road.
Okay.
I just want to say, I think that of all the public housing I've seen throughout the country, I think that might be the best public housing site in the country, if not in the world. And so go ahead and take a look at it sometime. It's really wonderful, and it has almost all of the design elements that you mentioned, and it is made with cinder block, but that means it's really sturdy. So thanks again.
Yeah, I do apologize because I study and research Detroit, and so I know Detroit better than I know Ann Arbor in some ways. But yes, there are definitely many public housing developments that have been rehabbed or built right the first time. Mm-hmm. And I should mention, like, the Brewster has been replaced by Brewster Homes that is quite nice. So that was built, I don't know, maybe about 20 or 30 years ago. And of course, we have other housing that's built with other programs that I didn't go into. I am quite familiar with some of the LIHTC housing, the low-income housing, tax credit housing, particularly Carrot Way. With fans in that particular complex. So I think we've learned something from the tower phase, and so housing design has improved notably.
So, okay, thanks again.
Sure.
I see in the comment, just quickly, somebody saying that they enjoyed they found the presentation informative. We have another person speaking, so if your time is limited and you need to go, that's totally okay. But before people thought that we were ending with June, we also have Jennifer with us tonight. So you can have people attend in February, and you can stay on the line if you're so inclined or have the time. Shirley, you had your hand raised, and it looks like you have a question.
How do can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, you just can't see me.
Correct.
Okay. Is this, first of all, I worked for Ann Arbor's housing, and I've been a housing director, so I have a lot of questions, but I'm sure you don't have a whole lot of time for my questions. But I'm just trying to figure out how do we get part of this meeting so that I can ask questions freely and be a part of this group. Do you have to join to be a part of this group, or
so I'm not entirely sure, so I'll answer a couple of different questions. So okay. For the next, I believe it's 7 months, Teresa, is that right? We will have a special presentation that's a little bit unusual from what HHSAB usually does, and it'll be sort of these learning series presentations on different topics. So those you can attend live like you're doing tonight, and you can ask questions by typing them into the chat or raising your hand like you're doing tonight. And then we will, currently this is recording, and it'll be shared via the places that those things are shared, Teresa, probably on the county website and some other social media type places. Another question that you might be asking is, who the heck is HHSAB, and can you attend this group? And the answer to that is also yes, you can attend. We meet on the second Thursday of the month all year round, usually except for December, or if we can't get enough people to have a quorum to pull together a meeting. And we are usually in the basement of the county building on Main and
Catherine?
200 North
Yep.
Main, yeah.
And you're totally welcome to join, whether those are Zoom meetings or in person in the basement. And we do Q&A or public comment at the start and end of those meetings as well.
Okay.
And then if your other question is how do you get on HHSAB, then you keep track of the city website for the boards and commission pages, and it'll show you if there are openings or seats on the board, which there are 2. Okay, I'm seeing lots of like unofficial sign language. So there are currently 2 open seats on the board, and there's a link on the boards on the city government webpage. It's like a 1-page, maybe a 2-page form that you fill in expressing your interest and your background and which boards you're interested in joining in. And then Travis and the other council members who are here will probably correct me on this one, but I believe that stack goes to the mayor for nominations based on the spots that are available. And then you're confirmed for a 2-year term. Did that answer the question that you were asking? Did one of those answers answer the question you were asking?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great. Did you have a question for June?
No,
Okay.
she gave a very good presentation, and it'd be interesting to talk to her so I could share experiences from Ann Arbor's housing. And I also was the housing director up in Muskegon and in Okemos. Be interesting to share some of that. But I'm just interested, just to let you know, in what's going on in Ann Arbor with its affordable housing and how I can be of help with the community, and how we can knock down this racism that exists here, because we do have a lot of it going on in housing as well as other areas.
Yeah, thank you for calling in tonight. And if you can stay the rest of our meeting, that'd be great. And if you're interested in joining HHSAB, I would encourage you to fill out that form online. And I think June had her email at the last slide. Was it J Thomas at UMich?
Thomas J.U. THOMASJU at umich.edu. And I do have to go, but if I can hand this other meeting off to someone, I will be back.
Great. Well, thank you for coming for the time you've been here so far.
Thanks so
Okay.
much, Professor Thomas.
Bye-bye.
Okay, I don't see any other questions right now. Let's move it over to Jennifer Hall.
Just real quick before Jennifer starts, Councilmember Briggs has joined us, and also County Commissioner Ricky Jefferson. And so I just wanted to acknowledge them and thank them for joining us as well. And I'm going to check really quick to make sure I didn't miss anybody. Hopefully I got everyone, so thanks. Jennifer, take it away.
Great, thank you. I just want to put a shout out to Shirley. Shirley, I think you and I have met before, and I am happy to talk to you anytime. And my phone number is 734-794-6721. I'm going to take what June talked about from a bigger national picture and try to bring it down to Ann Arbor specifically, but also Washtenaw County. One thing that I think we all know, but bears reminder sometimes, is just how wealthy of a community we are. I know the HHSAB has seen this in the city council many times, this chart, but our median income in Washtenaw County, Ann Arbor area is $106,600. By comparison, the United States is $79,900. But that doesn't mean that there isn't any poverty in Washtenaw County. It's just concentrated in some areas more than others. This map shows census tracts where 50% or more of households have incomes below 60% of the median income, or there's a poverty rate of 25% or more. This is actually a federal designation called a qualified census tract for some funding purposes. And if you look at the pattern and you're familiar with Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, you will notice a lot of poverty around U of M, EMU, and Washtenaw Community College. And it may be self-evident or not, but students do self-proclaim their income on the census. And so they're not necessarily proclaiming what their family's income. So they may only make, $2,000 or $3,000 a year. And therefore they look like they are impoverished when you look at census tracts. And you can see that in, this is just the city of Ann Arbor. This chart is showing poverty rate by age, and you can see that the vast majority are age 18 to 24. So poverty alone is not an indicator of a low-income neighborhood. In 2017, the Washtenaw County Office of Community Economic Development published jointly with the Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti Housing Commissions an assessment of fair housing. I highly encourage people who haven't seen this to go to this website and take a look at it. It has a wealth of data and recommendations to affirmatively further fair housing. And although I often hear from Ann Arbor residents when I'm in meetings that our properties, the Housing Commission properties, are a concentration of poverty, I think it's a misunderstanding of what that means. A concentration of poverty is not a single building in low-income households. It's surrounded by a neighborhood of homes in the $400,000, $500,000 homes. That is not a concentration of poverty. When people talk about a concentration of poverty, it's poverty not in just in one building, but large neighborhoods where everywhere you go, there's low-income households surrounding you. The county followed HUD guidelines in their report to identify what HUD calls racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty in Washtenaw County. And only 2 areas in the entire county met that criteria, both of which are in Ypsilanti. And one is overlapping Ypsilanti City and Ypsilanti Township. The part in yellow is the area south of Michigan Avenue, north of I-94. And the area in orange is just south of Superior Township, Clark Road area, and generally north of Huron River Drive and Huron Street. So those are the 2 areas in the entire county that have a concentration of poverty and racial concentration. Within the fair housing assessment was a opportunity index. The county worked with U of M Poverty Solutions to create an opportunity index to look at high and low opportunity areas based on all these items listed here: health, jobs, economic well-being, education, training, neighborhood safety, and stability. And you can see from the index that most of Ann Arbor is moderate to very high opportunity. So if we are going to address racial inequity, then the BIPOC community needs to have the opportunity as well as the choice to live in a high opportunity area. And we need to make sure we also increase opportunities in dense population areas with low opportunities. Now we're going to go back in time, and I'm going to start a discussion about creating the Ann Arbor Housing Commission and building public housing in Ann Arbor. This map is really important in understanding the discussions and decisions that were made in the 1960s related to forming the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, as well as developing affordable housing or public housing. The Black community in Ann Arbor was on the northwest side, what is generally in the 5th Ward. This is just concentrated on the urban corridor. If you were actually to blow this map out and look at the entire county, that light yellow would be the rest of the county. The dark orange areas show that the Black neighborhood in Ann Arbor was in and around what is now known as Carytown, and going west toward Chapin Street and north towards Summit. This was previously a industrial commercial area with slaughterhouses and other dirty industries in the 1800s and 1900s, which is why Black households were ending up in other non-white households, or ended up moving into those neighborhoods. That was one of the few places they were allowed to move. Jones School was the neighborhood school before it became community high school. 4th and Ann Street was the Black Business District. The Dunbar Community Center on 4th Ave was a central part of the Black social and civic life. And June mentioned, and there's a little bit of discussion about the Highway Transportation Act. I forget what it was called. There was actually a proposal, I think it was in the late 50s, maybe early 60s, that proposed going down Division and cutting over and connecting to the highway and have a highway bypass right through that community. And it was actually approved by City Council, but it was vetoed by the mayor at the time that stopped that from happening. So it almost also happened in the city of Ann Arbor. So if you look at the entire map, the county was highly racially segregated in 1960, and it continues to remain segregated by race and income now. The 2015 Martin Prosperity Institute's report called Segregated City, The Geography of Economic Segregation in America's Metros, named Washtenaw County the 8th most segregated county by income in the United States. Just like June talked about, there were racially restrictive covenants in our county. This is one that was found in the county. One of my previous houses I lived in actually had the same kind of covenant in it. And although there's not any historical redlining maps for Washtenaw County, there's definitely oral histories from people who lived through housing discrimination and segregation in our county. Back in the 1940s, when the Willow Run bomber plant was opened and there was a surge of employment, many African-American workers were not allowed to live in most neighborhoods, but they were permitted to live in neighborhoods already experiencing racial segregation. And the south side of Ypsilanti City was one of the few areas where people of color could purchase a home, and today is still a largely Black community. I actually went back and did a little bit of research on what happened, because I was not living here, nor was I barely born when the Housing Commission was first thought of. So I want to actually give a shout out to the Ann Arbor District Library. They have a really large archive of historical documents, newspaper articles on their website, where I copied these from. They also have a oral history from the Black community that has a lot of really good testimonies of living in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti as well, and the rest of Washtenaw County. So this is the historical context in which the Ann Arbor Housing Commission was formed. There was a very active civil rights organization in the 1960s, or several of them, and they were all involved in this idea of creating public housing in Ann Arbor to address the lack of affordable housing. When the commission was formed and the board was actually appointed by the mayor and city council, there's a lot of controversy over who would represent the community on this board. And there was a group called the Congress for Racial Equality that actually picketed City Hall, and they were opposed to the formation of the board. And it was because they did not believe that the members who were being nominated to the Housing Commission's board had enough personal knowledge about social and economic problems in Ann Arbor's low-income community. And the proposal actually passed 6-5 on party lines, with the Republican mayor and Republican majority approving the formation of the Housing Commission and the board, and the Democrats actually opposing it. This is actually a picture of the very first meeting of that board, as well as some city members, some city employees. I just wanted to highlight on the right a discussion of Dr. Albert Wheeler. Dr. Wheeler later became the city's first and only Black mayor in 1975, and actually Wheeler Park was named after him. He was the first tenured African-American professor at U of M, and he was very involved in civil rights on campus as well as the city. And he became the president of the local NAACP during this time. So I actually saw his name in a lot of articles talking about forming the Housing Commission. There's several articles, including this one, that talked about the impact on Black children who are bused to other neighborhood schools, and concerns are raised within the Black community related to where would public housing sites be located and the impact on the school system. This particular article mentioned a recent transfer of Black kids from the Jones School to other schools. And there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of articles and discussion about concerns about desegregation and about having dispersed housing, public housing within the city of Ann Arbor. And it was largely brought from the Black community with those kinds of concerns. And I saw an article where they had met with people from Chicago to talk about their public housing experience in there. And I'm imagining it was a lot related to those very high towers and those dense sort of failed public housing projects that led to that discussion. And actually the concerns weren't just local. This article talks about how the State Civil Rights Commission actually did an investigation of the Housing Commission plan because they wanted to make sure they were desegregated in scattered sites, because there were all kinds of ideas and sites that were, you know, looked around the city of where to put housing in, what it would look like. In addition to concerns by civil rights and human rights organizations, there was the usual NIMBYism and lots of articles about people not wanting any kind of public housing in their backyard as it continues today. Like 1968 and today, 2022, there's a lot of discussion about income disparity. It hasn't really changed in Ann Arbor. This article notes that Ann Arbor was the third highest average income in the United States in 1968, but that there was also a large number of low-income households. I thought it was interesting that then, like now, there was an indication of a lack of funding to administer the programs and take care of the properties. And that's why thousands of public housing properties all over the United States have been dilapidated, deteriorated, and demolished. This article talks about how the Housing Commission started out actually as a leasing from the private rental market and then releasing to low-income households. But eventually they ended up securing properties and funding to build the public housing that we have now, which I'm going to show in a moment. The Housing Commission in 1971 also started a lease to own program. And we had 57 houses all over the city that we built and were leased to own to our renters to homeowners. We still own one of these homes, but all the rest were sold. We're actually doing an analysis right now to see if we can figure out how successful this was as a program for building wealth for low-income households and particularly African-American home buyers. Because we know that in looking at some of our documents that some of the homeowners lost their homes to foreclosure, but we also know that other families formed a family trust and they still have family members living there. So I don't have the results of that study, but it will be coming out. All right, so that's sort of like in the late 60s, 70s of where we were and how we started out and why we ended up the way we look today. As of right now, we own 17 properties, 548 apartments, lots of vouchers. We have a homeowner program, and we have a family self-sufficiency program as well. This is just sort of a rundown of the size units that we have and some of the income restrictions that are on our various apartments. This is a map of not just Ann Arbor Housing Commission properties, but other properties in the city of Ann Arbor that are restricted and committed to affordable housing, whether it's senior housing or if it's privately or owned by a for-profit or a nonprofit like Avalon or Michigan Ability Partners. Those are all listed here. And you can see that some areas are well represented and others are not. The second ward has that little red dot is, I believe, Green Baxter, that Councilmember Griswold mentioned previously, is the lone property that's designated to as affordable housing in that particular ward. I don't exactly know when Ann Arbor started their voucher program. But this is a map of sort of where the distribution is of where people who have a tenant-based voucher, where they actually take their voucher out into the community and find a private sector property that will take their voucher, and one that's within their voucher amount. And so the whole idea of the voucher program came out after some of the failures of the public housing program to enable people to have mobility and to enable people to have choice on where they live. But the reality is that most communities, including Washtenaw County, is that even with these vouchers, residents have a hard time finding landlords, especially in a really high income, high opportunity areas like Ann Arbor. It's hard to find landlords that will accept their voucher. And so you end up with a disproportionate amount of vouchers for low income households in low income communities. This is a map, which again, I took from the Affirmatively Fair Housing study with all kinds of awesome information. This map shows both the distribution of vouchers. So the light to dark gray, the darker the gray census areas have the highest percent of households with voucher units living there. And then you can see there's like purple and green and blue circles representing actual properties that have the entire property, or probably most of the property, is designated as affordable housing, whether it's, our housing or somebody else's housing, as well as the Ypsilanti Housing Commission too. So on the one hand, it does make sense that there's both a concentration in urban areas where there's jobs, services, and some public transportation, but there's still a higher concentration of voucher use in these very high poverty, low opportunity areas. The city of Ann Arbor is a high opportunity, wealthy community, and our mission-driven development plans are to increase affordable housing in the city of Ann Arbor for low income and special needs households. Some of these new housing opportunities will include income-based rental subsidies like vouchers. Others will be below market rate rents, where someone with or without a tenant-based voucher could move there. And the goal is also to provide on-site voluntary services for people to stay housed with a wide range of service. I'm going to show some demographics of who are our tenants who are in our programs. The first column is the entire county. There's 141,000 households. We have 2,282 participants in our programs. We have project-based vouchers, tenant-based vouchers, and we have 12 homeowners. So you can see we do have a higher proportion of Black households compared to the percent of Black households in the county that participate in all of our programs. We have a higher proportion of families with children than in the county in general, as well as we have fewer senior households in participating in our programs. Probably on the senior side is because there are senior housing providers that specialize in senior housing, and we only just recently acquired a senior housing building. These are just some charts about wages as well as disability. We have fewer people with earnings from wages than the county in general. Many of them receive Social Security income and other types of benefits, and many are retired or have pensions. And we also have a higher proportion of households under the age of 62 as we track it, or 65 as the census track it, who are a person with a disability in the household. Our average income for our households is around $14,000 a year. Except for the participants in our homeowner program, and they tend to be obviously higher income, around $31,000 a year. Just as a reminder, the median income for the county is $106,000. So what is the legacy of both, the historical across the United States as well as what's happening locally? Really, if you do not have adequate income, you have much more limited housing choices. And in our community, in a lot of communities, the housing demand exceeds supply and it increases cost. It makes it harder, more homeless households. Nationwide studies, I've seen different studies, but somewhere between for every 4 or 5 income eligible households that could participate in a housing subsidy program of some sort. Only one is actually participating, not out of choice, but out of lack of resources to provide that kind of housing. And participation in these subsidized programs really requires you to surrender your privacy. A lot of people would say you have to surrender your dignity to participate, because we are always in your business, requiring all kinds of documentation about your family, your income, your assets, who you live with, who's in your household. And when you look at housing programs that are very successful on an international level, there's a couple examples where the government actually ends up being the primary provider of housing in the community. It's considered part of that public infrastructure like roads are. The housing that the government provides isn't specifically and only for low-income households. Anybody can live there. So there end up being a mixture of incomes. And if you want, you can live in government housing, or you can live in private housing. And the supply meets the demand. And those are the most ideal situation to make sure that anybody who needs housing has it, as well as giving people choices of where to live. And that, I think, is that's the last slide that I have. Would you like me to answer the co-op question first?
Yes, please.
There was a question about co-ops and why aren't there was a lot of co-ops built at the same time, really, that public housing was built in the late 60s and 70s in Ann Arbor, and other places too, but a lot in Ann Arbor compared to most communities. And the type of funding that was available for public housing no longer exists. The type of funding that was available for co-ops in the way they were built in Ann Arbor no longer exists. It was really highly subsidized financing. And June mentioned that, low-income housing tax credits. That's actually the single biggest source of funding now for any kind of new development of affordable housing. And that's actually administered by the IRS. It's not even administered by HUD. And it's actually paid for by private investors who get a tax write-off. And so it's a very different kind of model, a privatization model of affordable housing that we have right now. And why aren't there more built? Well, the type of funding doesn't exist that used to exist, but one of the reasons, particularly in Ann Arbor, this is my opinion about why the co-ops are so successful, is when they were first built, it wasn't as successful as they were, 15, 20 years after they were built, because you have to have, it was usually 80% of median income or 95% of median income, but you did have to meet income restrictions to move in and become a member. The membership rates were then and still are much lower than rents or housing costs if you own a home. And so they're very, very affordable. But once you move in, you don't have to move out. So like if you're in our housing, if your income gets too high, you have to move, or we just keep increasing your rent until you're like, it's not worth it to live here anymore. I'm going to go into the private sector. That's not the case with the co-ops, which I think is what makes them very successful, because over time, as people come in and out and new people are coming in with income restrictions, but you have long-term people living there with higher incomes, and you have a great mixture of incomes living there. The other thing about co-ops that is different from the kind of housing that we do is we require you, or HUD requires us that if your family size changes, like if you go from a one-person household and you have kids and then you have more kids, we cannot let you live in a one-bedroom apartment. We have to move you to a larger size apartment. And then when your kids move out and you're just there, you and you're retired, whatever, we have to downsize you to a one-bedroom apartment. And in the co-ops, you do not have to do that. So it makes for some weird situations where you have small families and large units there. But again, it's not as regulated as it is in the housing that the Housing Commission is involved in. So I hope that answers some of your questions about that. And I am not an expert on co-ops.
There's a question in the chat about community land trusts, which the HHSAB as a group has talked about, but did you want to touch on community land trusts or housing trusts?
Sure. again, not an expert on it, but it is something that I have done research on. Community land trusts are really a, well, I'm gonna tie, we're actually gonna have a whole session, I think, on co-ops and land trusts. I'm just gonna give a brief sort of overview. Cooperatives are privately owned. Obviously, housing commissions are publicly owned. Land trusts are also privately owned, but it's a model of trying to maintain long-term, low-cost ownership. It's kind of a hybrid ownership model. And the idea is that a private entity owns the property, the land, and then they can sell or lease. It's different, you know, you can set up differently the improvements, the buildings that are on top of it. And it usually has some kind of resale formula of some sort so that it limits the equity when you move, but that you get some kind of equity. And this is actually without actually forming a land trust in the city of Ann Arbor. We actually practice the same types of goals and policies through our zoning regs and deed restrictions. So the city has required private developers to have both homeowner and rental properties to include affordable housing within their projects. And then the city has a deed restriction as well as a resale formula on the ownership side, as well as restrictions on the rental side that serves sort of the same function as what land trusts do, but it's a publicly owned, you know, process and in the process of it.
I'll also flag that if people want to do a deep dive in the Ann Arbor Old News Library on housing trusts in Ann Arbor, there are some interesting old news articles about efforts to do housing land trusts in Ann Arbor and where those have gone. Amanda, your hand is raised.
Hey, Jennifer, could you just speak to, I think June had shared with us the investment that the federal government has made in housing for homeowners, white homeowners, middle class, but can you speak to the investment or disinvestment that the federal government has done to public housing over time?
Yeah, I love June, that you included that, because I like to include that statistic also when I do presentations. This is a close guess because I didn't look it up before you asked the question, but the HUD budget total, I want to say it's in the 50 or 60 billion, which is for every program, everything that exists, all the public housing that still exists, all the voucher programs out there, anything, the senior housing, all the programs is still less than the entirety of the mortgage tax interest deduction on our tax returns, of which I am a beneficiary as a homeowner.
There's a question in the chat about the unmet need for affordable housing in the county. The follow-up question is, how long is the wait list? I think the spoiler to the full answer will be that the wait list is shorter than the unmet need because it gets capped, but I'll let Jennifer answer that in greater detail.
I should say that I can tell you what our wait list is, but we are not the only provider of housing. And what we're finding is people through word of mouth, and because everything's online now, people can and do sign up for 10 wait lists, 50 wait lists, you know, all across the United States, or every wait list in their community. So people can be on more than one wait list. But when we last opened our wait list for both our housing that we own that has a rental subsidy attached to it, as well as our vouchers that are tenant-based, we had about 3,000 people apply for our tenant-based vouchers and a little over 2,000 people apply for our vouchers, or I'm sorry, our housing that we own. We have a turnover of maybe 150 households a year. So just through natural attrition in our housing, we can never meet that big of a demand. And lately, what we're finding though, is for every 100 people we pull off our wait list, we're getting about 20 to 30% response. And that's with sending letters, emails, text, phones, any way we can get a hold of someone. And we're pretty sure the problem is this issue of people being on multiple wait lists and getting, you know, finding housing somewhere else. So in some ways there's a huge demand, but on the other, we really don't know what the demand is.
Are you able, Jennifer, when you're, are you able to track on who is putting their name on your wait list, who is already in Ann Arbor or the surrounding area versus, like when I taught in Chicago, I'd have students leave in the middle of the year because they got a voucher in Des Moines and their family was going to go get that voucher. Are you able to sort of track your lists that way?
We do. I don't know off the top of my head, but we adopted a preference. There's a couple of things you can do for preferences. You can have a preference for homeless, which we do. You can have a preference for people with a disability. You can have a preference for seniors, and you can have a preference for people with jobs. You can have a preference for people who are living or working in your municipality. So we have a preference for all of those except for the preference for people with jobs. And when we changed and added that preference, we found we had a smaller number of people applying. So before we had that preference, we had 15,000 applicants when we opened our wait list, and it went down to 3. We think it's because of our preference, because it was focused on our community, and we ended up having a lot higher percentage that were from our community. I want to say it was 60 or 70%, but I can't remember off the top of my head.
Thank you. Teresa, did you have anything to add to finish the part about how long is the wait list and how much unmet need is there in the county?
Sure. Just one other piece. We manage the Ann Arbor wait list for just a handful of below market units in downtown Ann Arbor. So 8 at Beekman on Broadway, and then another 16 at Ann Arbor City Apartments. There's about 750 people on that wait list now. And I will say that probably it's more like 90% are Ann Arbor or adjacent, like in Washtenaw County people that are on that list. Now we probably do need to check and have people update it, see if they've moved out, but it's really hard to pin down that exact need. When we did the 2015 housing study for Washtenaw County, we looked at the urbanized area and we identified that we needed to add 157 units every year for 20 years in high market areas, so Ann Arbor and Pittsfield in particular. So that was in 2015, and I think we could all agree that the market has even accelerated since then. And we've seen that play out with a lot of other communities adding or creating affordable housing committees, including Chelsea and Dexter, the city of Ypsilanti. So it's not just what we might have thought of as really just Ann Arbor, an immediately adjacent issue 7-8 years ago. Now it's definitely countywide. We know that a lot of vouchers, the value of the voucher, people can't find apartments or apartments for that amount in Washtenaw County. They're getting priced entirely out of the county. So again, I couldn't give you an exact number, but we're way behind. And a lot of times when we talk about it, we just say we need more housing and we also need more affordable housing. So we're definitely at a deficit in both.
David?
I had a couple questions that came up from that great presentation, or the 2 great presentations we've had. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Professor Thomas. That was really helpful stuff. One thing that came to mind was you mentioned briefly the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. And I don't know if you want to talk to how long has that been around, and has it been around long enough that you're starting to see data that you could kind of measure the outcomes of that?
It's been around at least longer than I've been at the Housing Commission. So I'm going to guess about 15 plus years. And we used to contract out the person who would work with our Family Self-Sufficiency Program. So what it is it's a voluntary program. You can either live in our housing or have a voucher. And if you want to participate, then the goal is really to increase your economic self-sufficiency, so you no longer are reliant on any kind of public funding, and not including housing. Though you can still actually live in our housing and graduate from the program, but like food stamps or something like that. So what happens is we started a baseline when you join the program, and if your income is $10,000, it's a 5-year program, and you grow your income to $20,000. In our program, as your income increases, your rent portion increases that you pay. And what we do is we match it. So if your rent increases by $100 a month, we essentially match it and put $100 into an escrow account. And when you graduate, and you have to have goals, and you have to, you meet the HUD guidelines, but when you graduate, you essentially get that escrow account. And many times people want to buy a home, or they want to go to school, or they will need to buy a car for a job. And so you can take your funds from this escrow account and use it really for whatever it was that you wanted to do, as long as you met your goals of the program.
Do you have any like outcome data on that?
If we do, I'm writing down the things that I don't know that I'm going to provide for you guys to share. I will find out what our outcome data, what kind of things are you looking at? Want to know about? How many people?
Well, I thought, yeah, I mean, I thought about it in the context of, you just previously mentioned the kind of, I guess, a rent to own program that was used in the 70s, and kind of tracking back, how that resulted in transfer of wealth to the family, or retention of wealth in the family or not. And I know that FSS program is different, but if one of the primary goals is to get people to a point where they have enough money to put a down payment on a house or something, like how often does that actually happen? Is it successful in doing those kinds of things for people? Is it an essential part of any housing program, or is it not? Is it a bells and whistles kind of thing, I guess, is what I'm wondering.
Is anybody on HUD watching this presentation? It's a lot of bells and whistles. It's a hard thing for people to graduate from, but we do have people who graduate. And a lot of times, sometimes I feel like they would have graduated without any help from us. Families who are going back to school, getting a better job, or starting their own business. But we absolutely do also provide assistance in a lot of different ways. And many people don't graduate from the program and they stay in our housing. But I will find out what our graduation rates are, and I will provide that information to you.
When you said you'd provide that to us, also it'd be when you get the report for the outcome of your research on the home ownership program, that would be great to hear about too.
Yep, absolutely.
It looks like Jeff, council member Hayner, your hand is raised. Oh, I think Teresa's doing. Do I have that power? I don't have that power. I do not have the power to call on you. The people with the power to call on you. Aha, welcome. Hi, you're live and we're ready to hear your question. Councilmember Hayner, we have you unmuted, but I don't know.
Hello?
Yes, yeah. Hi,
Oh,
we can
okay.
hear you.
Yeah, I clicked on the one thing, but the other one didn't do it. Okay, so we're stepping back one after Mr. Blanchard's questions, but you mentioned the various ways in which vouchers are taken in our community. And at Beekman at Broadway, which is here in Ward 1, we've allowed the owner of that property to do a means test. So he's choosing from what you might consider the top of the list instead of the bottom of the list, if we were to rank people in their ability to pay or their income levels. So I know there's a certain minimum income level that people have to meet to be awarded a voucher, but then the property owner in this case is allowed to do a means test on their income. And I was told by some people who were on that list that they didn't make enough to be allowed into that, and they were passed over for somebody who earned more than they did, even though everyone qualified for that voucher. And so it would seem to me, if that's factual, in a situation like that, we're letting the provider of the affordable housing pick and choose in a ranked way who they want. So it might not be the people who are most in need of that assistance or that housing, but the people who are most able to pay for that. And so in a community that has a very high median income level, like my family has been at 60 AMI in the past, family of 4. Are we really helping those most in need when we have these programs coordinated this way? Second part of that is, what can we do to change that so we are helping those who are most in need and most likely to fall through the cracks that are desperately in need of housing?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, in that this is why I say that really the ultimate solution is to have so much housing out there that is government provided and not private provided, that we meet that huge need for all kinds of incomes. Like that's the solution. That is a very expensive solution. And I know you said vouchers for Beekman, but they actually don't have vouchers, but they have below market rate rents. But the same thing happens with people with vouchers. When they're out there looking for a place with this tenant-based voucher that's supposed to give them mobility and the ability to choose where they live, landlords still look at their credit score or make sure they have 3 times their income. So Beekman's process isn't really any different than what is already happening everywhere in the community. And it is not a mission-driven, mission-based type of program to make sure that we do serve the lowest income households. And that is one thing in our discussion about when we do create guidelines for the city millage funds. And one of the principles that city council adopted was to make sure that we have mission-driven developer, owner, property managers that are trying to screen people in, not screen people out, and that will work with people who have whatever's going on in their life. If they have a lease violation, they're not paying their rent, it's not immediately an eviction. It's what's happening in your life. What's going on? What can we do to help? We don't want you to lose your housing. We need to address this issue. It's a very different way of approaching housing.
Can I just add to that? The only place that I would say I know that we are targeting the most in need would be through homeless assisted permanent housing, and that Ann Arbor Housing Commission takes referrals through this process, Avalon Housing, Michigan Ability Partners, the Family Empowerment Program, and YHC. And that's really whereby the homeless system has come together and said, we are going to target the available permanent housing resources for people who have experienced homelessness, and we're targeting them to the most in need. And we have an assessment that we use to do that, and also a case conferencing process whereby all of the agencies, service provider agencies, are in the room together making those decisions and really targeting the folks that are most in need. So it's a very unique process that doesn't happen in the private sector.
And it costs more money, and it's way more labor intensive, and it works.
Councilmember Hayner, did you have any other questions?
No, I'll let you guys get on with it. I mean, I do, but I have other ways to get them answered. So thank you.
Well, and keep joining us, for the future series, and you can ask them throughout all of our, next six, right? Yeah, 6 more learning series. There's a question in the chat, and I don't know, this might be a Jennifer or a Teresa question. We had the 2015 report on housing affordability and economic accessibility for Washtenaw County. Is there any thought or desire for the city or the county to update or commission a similar follow-up report?
So one thing that we do whenever there's new census data, there was a number of tables in there, the data point that came from census data that actually helped to sort of come up with the number, the target number or our goal. So we actually do update those regularly and share them out, but we haven't done the whole process. I think there is interest in it. I would say, just from my perspective, 2 things. It's only going to be worse. We only need more. And so part of me doesn't necessarily want to spend the time on the study as much on the implementation. So there's a part of me that would like to do it for the county, because I do think the impact on broader, like I'd want it to be broader at this point. We just did City of Ann Arbor, Pittsfield, Ypsi Township, and I think Superior initially. And so it would be nice to see some other communities and look at that. But at the same time, I think we would be doing, I think we know the results of the study. So it's one of those things. Do we want to do that to get buy-in, to share that with everyone, or do we want to just work on implementation? So that's how I think about it anyway. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Jennifer.
I agree. Maybe in 5 or 10 more years, we do it again.
And have some good things to show.
Yeah, hopefully have some good things to show.
There's another question. Oh, David, did you have a question? No.
Well, if there, yes, I do, but if there are more,
I just thought I saw your hand.
Yeah. Well, I
Okay.
could throw this out quickly and then we'll move on. But just to follow up on the co-op question, it might be a question for somebody else too. Like maybe we should talk about it at a different presentation as well, because I have heard a lot of interest in the community for why don't we have more of these co-ops? Why can't we do it? So, Jennifer, you mentioned that the funding mechanism for that is gone now. Who would we talk to? Would you know, or who would we talk to if people wanted to explore, like, how could you recreate that funding mechanism, or what did it look like? Is it private investors? Is it public investors? Like, it's just a financing model of some sort, right? And
Right.
I don't know if there's a way that we could, simulate that or something, go back and simulate that to incentivize co-ops, or if that's just not worth following down that trail.
Well, there are actually, there is interested in the community, and actually people talking about the ICC. I've met with them, and there's a, or is that the national co-op, the local co-op, the student co-op?
Yeah, ICC.
Yeah, it's ICC.
They're looking at expanding their model and provide cooperative housing, not primarily for students, but expanding it to non-students. So I've had a lot of conversation with them that you can apply for tax credits as a co-op. It's like any other affordable housing project. You have to pull together enough resources with enough equity, essentially, grant money, essentially, to enable you to have low cost housing costs. So whether that's a membership fee, whether that's rent, whether that's a mortgage, it's going to need a significant subsidy because it's so expensive to build. And so it's no different than, what we have to go through, or Avalon has to go through to try to put a project together. You got to figure it out. And I think it's just somebody has to be the developer. What is the incentive and who's going to do it to start a private co-op? Somebody has to take that up. It's not a public entity necessarily that would do that.
And I did want to flag that our meeting topic for March is going to cover some of these ideas. There was a question from a bit ago, and Krista Hughbanks. I'm not entirely sure that I understand your question, and so I wanted to give you the opportunity, if you wanted, we could put you on you could have the microphone to ask the question. And okay, great. So sure. Hi. What we have June Thomas and Jennifer. Well, June Thomas is back with us, and so the question, Jude, I don't know if you saw it in the chat, is about redlining in general. But Krista, could you share your question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So what I'm talking about is the home ownership programs that are offered like through FSS, the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, and things of that sort to these families that are living in low income and that are trying to build. I know FSS because I used it myself. And so what I want to know is that a discussion redlining?
Oh no, Krista, Your audio cut out. Did
Depending
it
on
cut
what
out for
program you
everyone?
go through.
Sorry, Krista,
And-
your microphone cut
can-
out for a little bit. Are you back?
I think that, yeah, the connection is kind of unstable.
Okay, so could you just repeat your question for the group?
So to just sum it up, I just want to know if that's a question that, or is that redlining being discussed amongst these programs? Because I find that when you are of color, you do go through more challenges. And I can't recall who mentioned that. I think his name was Jeff, and he kind of talked a little bit about that. And that's so true. And so I'm wondering, and it's like that. It's somewhat similar to redlining. And then it definitely becomes questionable, like what's happening behind scenes when you are being offered these programs and you are taking advantage of them. And then you find that you have limited opportunities when you get there.
I don't doubt that. I don't know. I'm gonna pass to Jennifer. I don't know if she knows anything about that.
I think what we're talking about really is there is institutional racism in pretty much any institution you can think of. I mean, there's all kinds of new information coming out that doesn't have to be redlining, but where people have prejudices in things like assessing somebody's house, where they might assess it much lower than its value if it's a Black family living there versus a white family. That's not redlining, but that has a real impact and does really happen to people. And or landlords, you know, fair housing issues with landlords that will or will not rent to you, or realtors who still steer people to certain neighborhoods based on their race. So like all those kinds of things still happen, absolutely. And it doesn't have to be as obvious or bold as a literal red line map. There's even studies that have shown that online advertising steers people to certain neighborhoods based on who they think you are based on your online profile. So there's all that kind of discrimination going on all over the place, 100%.
Yeah, so absolutely. So there are agencies, metropolitan fair housing centers usually, who have been trying to at least identify the most obvious of those kinds of cases. But it's pretty limited because mainly they're testing like whether a real estate agent is treating you differently if you're a person of color than they would a white person, or whether a Black couple is treated differently than a white couple by an apartment rental agent. But yeah, just as Jennifer said, there are all kinds of ways that discrimination, more subtle than that, in specific programs could take place. Because, I mean, we still are living in the midst of prejudice, institutional racism.
How do we address that?
And just to give a hat tip where we can, the city of Ann Arbor did recently make it include within its discrimination policies that you can't discriminate against somebody for their income source for housing, but that still sort of requires an enforcement end of things. But at least by the books, you can't deny somebody rental based on where their payment is coming from. Did that address your question, Ms. Eubanks?
Yes. I guess I just want to know if there's steps being taken to address that, or how to go about doing so and to be more effective in that approach.
There are fair, depending on what the issue is, there are fair housing centers like, you know, all over the United States, and they're kind of geographically located. So there's a fair housing center that covers our area. I was just looking up what the phone number was real quick. We are South Central Michigan, I believe.
And in terms of rental, Travis, would that be something that the rental commission would take on once formed?
Yeah, it certainly could. So that body is, I believe, going to be seated here in the next couple of meetings, and then they'll be able to meet and start forming their own governance and be able to start addressing issues as well.
Okay. Great.
So
Thank you.
I would just, it's heartrending, to hear about this and then to hear the question, what do I do about this? Because one of the things you do is unfortunately expect injustice in general, and then keep speaking up just like you did just now, so that people can begin to respond. Because when we're quiet and it's just allowed to go on, then it goes on. But at some point we have to call out and say this is taking place. And it takes a lot of energy and it takes a lot of courage to do that. But that's the only way, that's the only thing we can do sometimes.
Yeah, and I work with residents and helping them to identify some of those barriers and things. So that's why I'm like really reaching out. I know my experience, but I know that, they're currently experiencing this, and, it does have an impact and it carries with you. And so I just would like to know the best way to, advocate for them and make sure that we're addressing these issues.
And depending on the issues, there's two places that we refer our tenants to, the Fair Housing Center as well as Legal Services, if it's a housing issue. They're both very good in our area. But there's Legal Services and Fair Housing Centers, all across the United States for folks to have access to.
Thank you. Thank you. I
Thank
thank
you for
everybody
your
who gave me.
comment. Yeah. Okay, we're kind of wrapping up close to the end of our time. I did, for the sake of the record, and just in case Professor June Thomas didn't see it, want to include in the recording this shout out that one of our attendees attended a talk of yours over 5 years ago, just after the 2016 election, and you offered words of hope in the talk that our guest has gone back to countless times and quoted you over and over again, and that when things seem too bad and hard and overwhelming to take action, to go to your corner of the world and do good there. So thank you, June Thomas, for your kindness and wisdom then and now. So getting that in the recording.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
Great. Thank you for being here. We have a few items of business on the HHSAB agenda to take care of really quickly. We have our next meeting, that's the learning session, will be, I can scroll and find this page of my packet, hold please. Will be February 10th. It'll be talking about the local market, U of M's impact on housing, on the housing market, and challenges for businesses in the community. And then March 10th, we'll pick up some of these comments about co-ops and other land trusts and affordable home ownership models. So that'll be on March 10th. And then we have these meetings going through into July. So we're going to move to the regular portion of the HHSAB packet. I expect attendees will slowly start dropping off, but we